Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, fall foliage photography and editing workflows, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Charlie Reinertsen. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Over to you, Charlie.
Thank you and welcome everyone. I'm excited to talk about some photography tips and take a look at fall foliage, which is happening right now. Today's chat, we'll just take a look really quickly at my path to photography, and then I'll take you on a fall foliage tour. I'm calling in from Saranac Lake in the Adirondacks, and right now it's just past peak foliage. So these last couple weeks have been really fun. And we'll take a look at photos from around the country. And then next, after that, we'll take a look at some tips and camera settings. And then finally, we'll look at what happens when you bring those photos back to your computer and ways that you can edit them to try and capture the feeling or what you saw when you were in the field taking your photos. And this is really, I'll be showing some software and some products that I use, but really all of this can be done with any camera, your phone, and then you can choose how much of this you might want to integrate into your own photography. So thanks for joining, and let's jump in. Just a little bit about my background. I've been doing science communications for the last more than 10 years, and I've been guiding with natural habitat adventures for the last 2 years. And my guiding experience is really centered around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, where I spent a few years living and working. And since then, I've been working with different conservation groups to be able to tell incredible stories about these ecosystems that we share. And I've most recently worked on an exhibit that brought me up to this part of the country. It's at the Wild Center. It's a climate solutions exhibit featuring different climate stories. And that work actually brought me out to some of the ecosystems that I've been focusing on in my photography and video work. So I've always wanted to stay focused on kind of outdoor industry and conservation groups and groups working to try and restore the planet. And that love of nature and wild places really stems from being a research biologist and studying softshell turtles in Minnesota. And that kind of introduced me to this incredible cast of characters of these the wildlife that lived in the river, in the Mississippi River. And so that was my introduction to trying to capture all of these amazing creatures that I was studying through photography. And ultimately that led me to pursuing that in all different nooks and corners of the world. And so today I'd love to give you just a quick fall foliage tour in a few of my favorite places. Some of these are places that NatHab trips travel to, and I'll highlight that as well. This photo is taken in northern New Hampshire, almost on the Canadian border. And this photo is one of my favorites. It's really fun to play with water and reflections when you're doing your fall photography. And the other kind of factor that comes in is light and where light illuminates the landscape. So this is one of my favorite photos, just getting some of that mist on the water over this really glassy pond. And this rolling hillside that creates a really interesting composition. And obviously that kind of last light of the day, that golden hour coming in and lighting the trees on the top where there's a lot of fall color. So we'll talk about how to edit an image like that in a little bit. Another thing that I like to play with is the early morning. In these fall mornings, you have really incredible light, and then you also have these great interactions between water and the air when the water is warmer than the air. So this is a great opportunity to get out there and just start playing around with the settings to see what you can capture. I also like to take a really close look at things and try to capture some interesting compositions that maybe other folks might pass up. And so looking at lily pads as they die back and start to have color, looking for surprising places that you might be able to capture and share. Again, back to that lily pad, kind of that late summer, early fall transition. Another interesting area that is really fun to explore is bridging that astrophotography world of night sky photography and then using some lights, in this case just a headlamp, to try and illuminate a tree to show that this photo was taken in the fall with fall foliage. That tree was in kind of a full orange yellow color, a maple. That was another photo taken up in northern Hampshire. While I was working for a conservation group, I was sent up in a high wing plane to be able to get images of Maine, in particular in Rangeley, Maine. And so this photo shoot was just spectacular. It was full fall color and clouds rolling across and kind of highlighting and obscuring different portions of the landscape. And this can be a really exciting time, but part of today's chat is that this can be a huge challenge. And what's interesting about this flight is it actually convinced me to switch camera systems, because different cameras, whether it's your phone or whether it's a big SLR camera or even mirrorless, they all come with different software that's interpreting the landscape. And it's telling the camera, okay, this part of the image is this particular shade of red or this particular shade of green. And certain camera systems shoot really flat. And so a flat light essentially is, when you look at it, there's not a lot of pop, there's not a lot of color, especially when you're shooting raw photography. And so I prefer a really flat image on the intake because then I can come and edit it and try and add in the color to the point that I remember. Because my process for photography is trying to recreate my memory of that place and try and recreate it as specifically as possible to what I was experiencing. And the camera doesn't always do that. And certain people, that's why you'll hear people have loyalty to a certain camera. And it might be because they just like that color profile of that system. And so this photo shoot, I ended up fighting the post-processing a lot, where I was trying to get the color balances right. And even looking at this image, I love this image, but I'm not convinced that that's what I was seeing at that time. And so this really kind of made me think about shifting over to a different system that I could get more of a flat image and then bring the color in. And we'll talk about how to do that. But this is it's a huge challenge to be able to capture fall accurately because there's just this a wide range of color in the image, which challenges the camera software, and it also challenges our eyes. Fall, there's also a lot of atmospheric things happening. There can be really crisp atmospheres, and there can also be some moist, damp atmospheres, and those both kind of affect the quality of the light and how your camera is interpreting it, which can be challenging. This is a shot taken on the ground up in Rangeley, Maine on that same assignment, early morning light. And here you're starting to see this broad range of color, and in particular, this focus on yellow. And so we'll talk about that a little bit as we get into the workflow. Another exciting area to explore is looking at motion and how you can either freeze motion or allow motion to be able to be interpreted through streaks in the image. And here on this image of a river, I've created a really long exposure and put the focus on the leaves to be able to draw your eye there, but also give this sense of movement. And here is an image in the Tetons from the Gros Ventre Mountains looking west. And there's, if you can look really closely, there's a little bit of snow up in the trees in the foreground. So that's part of what I really love about this image. And it kind of captures a lot of different habitats in this area. And Grand Teton National Park is definitely one of those areas that you can visit on Natural Habitat Adventures trip with the hidden Yellowstone departure. Really fun departure. And if you were to travel there in middle or end of September, you'd be able to see a scene like this. You've got the cottonwoods along the Gros Ventre River that are just starting to put on a show here with the yellow leaves. And then it's also an exciting time to get out into prairie ecosystems and some of those flats and be able to get a beautiful contrast between the orange, yellow colors that you can start to get and plants dying back, and then also the sky and clouds. So this shot was taken just outside Laramie, heading towards the Medicine Bow National Forest. And this shot is in the Green Mountains in Vermont, and trying to get a sunrise or a sunset photo where the colors in the sky are mirroring those colors in the landscape. That's a really exciting area. And I remember editing this photo. We'll talk about highlights and shadows and how you can regain some detail in the shadows. And this was definitely an image where I brought up some of the dark areas of the image, made them a little bit brighter, but not too bright, to try and balance this out. And we're up to the Adirondacks, and this was taken maybe a week and a half ago on a pond near my house during peak fall color, and just that incredible reflection. Really excited about these shots. And then I'm always thinking about how to bring the foreground into the image to try and give context, both to show that the color is true and that it's actually reflecting what you saw. Because if someone can see that boat and they see, oh, that the metal is accurate, it looks like metal, and the wood is accurate, it starts to give them some believability to the scene, and it gives them a little bit more context of what they're looking at, versus this image before. It's gorgeous, but it doesn't have that same context of an object in the foreground to be able to tell you, oh, this is real, this isn't just photoshopped or kind of edited in a grotesque way. And one last shot here. I really love this one for the image itself. The area was getting a lot darker, so I had to shoot with a higher ISO because this was a handheld shot in the canoe. And I really wanted to freeze motion in the water, so I wanted a fast shutter speed. And then just getting that little floating leaf in the foreground made it for a really nice composition for me. So I was excited about this one. All right, so let's dive into some of these tips and camera settings, and we'll kind of work our way from being in the field and taking pictures, and then we'll work our way back to we have our photos and we're at the computer and we're going to edit them, and then I'll actually edit a couple photos live to see what my workflow is like. So just kicking things off with composition and subjects. Often when I think about myself as a photographer, I feel like I'm trying to simply observe beautiful things and try and do them justice. And so for me as a wildlife and landscape photographer, I'm trying to just be a reporter on the scene and try and compose an image that transports someone there and gives them the feeling that they're there with me. And so what do I mean by painting with light? For me in this image, what's really dramatic about it is just thinking about that block of color, trying to separate the image into blocks. So we have this triangle of green in the middle section of the image, and then we have a triangle of yellow that kind of mirrors it in another way. And I'm not crazy about the sky in this photo. I wish that I had put on a filter to be able to darken that. There's some things that we can do in post to be able to fix that, and some maybe scary things now with artificial skies that can be dropped in at just a click. But from a compositional standpoint, looking at a landscape, it can be a little bit overwhelming because there's so much that you might focus on. And for me, I'm trying to think about, almost squint or blur your image a little bit. You can even look with your camera and intentionally have it be out of focus just to see where the color blocks are, and then think about trying to create a composition based on that. This is that image that we were looking at earlier, and this is another example of that. I was really thinking about a symmetrical image because we have this perfect mirror, but then what's a way that you can create a little bit of asymmetry? And I took a lot of pictures leading up to this moment in this same composition. And there are some that I have where this whole scene is lit up really beautifully. But to me, what was really compelling was having just the tops of those trees lit up on the hillside as it comes down, and then that full sweep on the other side being lit pretty evenly. And to me, that was the image that really stood out. So the next concept is to play with multiple compositions and position of the light source. So typically when I'm outside, that light source is the sun. And so this next series of images they each have their own feel, and I'm not sure which one I prefer, but they all are very different. But they're all shooting these two leaves that I found. It was a yellow leaf and a green leaf, and these are beech leaves. I took this in Massachusetts. And I really loved just those two overlapping leaves, the contrast there. And so this first image, my goal was to create that starburst. And so we know to be able to make the sun do that, we have to have a really small aperture, so like an f16 or more if your lens goes up higher than that. And then the focus needed to be on the leaves themselves, and the sun needed to be partially obscured by those leaves to be able to get that effect of what we're seeing there. And so this image, to me, it's a little bit harsh. It shows the daytime. There's this interesting interplay of the shadows and the light. But this is the same two leaves, just shot differently. Rather than put the sun directly behind it, now the sun is off frame, and I'm shooting at the leaves with a really shallow depth of field, and I'm trying to isolate those leaves from the surrounding environment. And then it heightens that drama of the overlap of those leaves to be able to create that negative space between where it's dark. So then here's another image of those leaves, same exact leaves, just giving the sun, putting it at the top of the frame, having a really wide aperture, so you're not going to get the sharp lines coming off of the sun. Instead, it's going to be just kind of this wash coming from the top of the image. And this one gives a really soft feel. Even the colors are different. So that shows, like, when you're out taking pictures, again, I'm not sure which one of these I love the most, but each of them tells a different story. And to me, they don't really work together. I wouldn't show these together other than for the purposes of talking about composition and light. I would use these in different applications. But it's really important to be playful, to just try, okay, what does it look like when I position myself in a different place in relation to this subject? And where is the sun? And can I put it in a different place in relation to what I'm shooting? The other thing I try to remind myself, and I'm not very good at it, is that there's more to fall than leaves. And so thinking about what other creatures can we photograph in an environment that looks like it's starting to fall apart. And so if you've spotted it yet, there's a green frog right in the center of that frame. And he's sitting in a pool of lily pads that are starting to fall apart and die. This shot is of a pronghorn, and it's a great time of year to be able to take photographs of wildlife because the landscape is starting to get some muted hues, some more browns and subtler greens. In the springtime, if I were to take this same shot of this pronghorn in that same place and the same composition, I don't think I would like it as much because the bright sage and the bright green of the grass would be distracting. So this is just a really wonderful time of year to do some wildlife photography. And then the last tip, just while you're in the field, is to not forget to look down. And so what kind of compositions can we create? What kind of still lifes can we just find in the world and then try to capture? And I've tried to manipulate landscapes or leaves and then take a picture, and to me, maybe it's just my eye, but it always feels manipulated. So I'm always trying to find something that's in a position that I like and that's lit well, and then I'll take a photo, just because I feel like it feels very staged otherwise. And here's another shot just looking down, thinking about water droplets on leaves. And this was early fall. Those oak leaves hadn't quite changed yet. Another thing to think about, and I mentioned this earlier, is playing with time. And that's a great opportunity. Cameras always are playing with time because this is captured instance. And so thinking about trying to blur motion, and one of the big tools in the field that you can use are neutral density filters that attach to your camera. It's just sunglasses for your camera, and it makes the incoming light darker, which what that allows you to do is lengthen the shutter time for a good exposure. We can talk about all those variables later, but For now, just note that if you put something dark on your camera lens that's a filter, neutral density filter, it'll give you a better opportunity to take a shot like this where you're blurring motion. Similarly on this image, freezing motion, trying to get a really fast shutter speed to be able to freeze it in place and be able to show that mist coming off. And now we will dive into camera settings, tips, and tricks. So these are we're still in the field, we're still with the camera, and I've divided this up into kind of an entry level if you're just starting to play with more manual settings, things to think about. And something that I'll mention at this point in the talk is just that you can take incredible pictures on fully automatic mode. So everything that I'm about to say, it can start to get overwhelming quickly. What I'd suggest is picking one thing and trying it out and starting to play around with that setting, and then eventually add another one on. And once I show all the settings, you can just take a picture of the screen to be able to save that and reference it later. So for the first recommended step for beginners, if you're on a camera, this would not be on phones, is setting your ISO. So I would recommend trying to keep it as low as possible because that's the best image quality. It makes the camera really sensitive to light. And so you're setting it for between 100 and 300. And then the next piece would be to select your shutter speed. And the quick rule of thumb to be able to make sure that you have a crisp image if you're shooting by hand without a tripod is to double the length of your lens. So for instance, if you have a 50 millimeter, okay, 100, and that's the fraction of your shutter speed. So if I'm shooting with a 50 millimeter, I need to keep the shutter speed at 1/100th or faster. So 1/150, 1/200. And if you start finding that you need to bump up the ISO to be able to get the right exposure, then put your camera on a tripod. Or if you need to go below 1/50 for a 50 millimeter, you really need to be getting on a tripod to be able to make sure that everything is crisp and that you don't have any movement from hand holding. Another tip that if you're not on a tripod and you need more stability is to try and get your elbows into your chest and to hold that way. And then as you release your breath at the bottom of it, that's when you're most stable. So then trying to stabilize that way. And no matter what shutter speed you have, even if you're shooting really fast, the more you can keep that camera stable, the crisper your images are going to be. So that next item to think about is white balance. And this is a big one to be able to set you up for success later. Sometimes this makes it so that you don't need to do any post editing. And sometimes this just shortens the amount of time it takes to be able to get really nice photos from post. So for white balance, selecting the setting based on daytime or cloudy, go in and change that and make it manual. And what that does, if you have a manual setting, even if you're selecting a preset like this, is that if you have a collection of photos from the same scene or the same area, they're all going to feel and look the same. If you select auto white balance, you might get disappointed because you might, with 10 different images from the same place, one of them might be really green and one of them might be really magenta. And so this helps avoid that and standardize everything. And then the next thing to start thinking about is f-stop. So if you want a shallow depth of field, just putting one thing in focus, having a really low number, which is a wide open hole, or a really narrow f-stop if you want everything to be in focus. And then another big thing that I've started doing recently, because phone technology it's just exponentially increasing in how good it is. You can take absolutely phenomenal photos with your phone. And I often will take a photo of so if I'm doing a shoot with my big camera, I'm out taking a lot of photos, I'll try and take reference images with my phone. And what that helps me do is I can then in post editing pull up that image from my phone and see how the phone interpreted the color and then use that as a reference point when I'm editing color in my big camera. It's not always great, but it's nice to have another interpretation of what you were looking at to try and see. It can help you understand, ooh, that image is really orange, or that image is really green. So then the next level, and apologies if this is getting a little bit dense, I'll try and move through it quickly and you can just take a photo of this. Shooting raw is number one. Raw image file format is a pain because it's a really big file, but it's also really awesome because it gives you more information to be able to play with when you're editing in these programs. So that's a big one. And the other thing that you can do is get a color card or a gray card. And those look something like this. And you can, when you're out in the field about to take a bunch of pictures, you take a picture of this in the area where you are, and that allows you later to be able to set the white point off of this. And these will either be gray cards, or you can get a set that also has colors as well. And I'll show you in post how to use an image that you've taken of this to be able to help you set the color balance properly. And that last one, before I go on, is just thinking about lens filters. Remember that image where I was like, oh, I don't love the sky on that. If I had put a lens filter on that, either a polarizer or a neutral density filter, it helps bridge the gap a little bit between the land and the sky, and it darkens the sky, and then the land and the sky are in a more even relationship with one another. So that's definitely something to explore. And the way that I would treat this is, if you don't know something that's on this list and you want to know more about it than what I'm providing here, there's just an incredible wealth of information. And I would highly recommend anything that Adobe does in terms of free education videos that they have, and just search how to bracket expose images. So that was another bullet on here that I didn't talk about too much, is just if you get really advanced and you want to do a lot of post editing, you can start to take one image and have a really dark image, a medium dark image, a perfectly exposed image, an overexposed, and an overexposed. Then you layer all those together, and what that allows you to do is the really bright parts of your photo, you're not losing information, and the really dark parts, you're not losing information, because you essentially blend all of those layers in post. So those are some advanced things, definitely worth researching or looking at if you're curious about them. And all of these are pretty big rabbit holes that you can dive into. And the thing that I'd recommend is that if you start getting overwhelmed, just remember that no matter what you do, you can take great pictures in auto, and you can take great pictures at any knowledge level that you have of these different tips and tricks. So now we'll head into some workflow examples. Before we do this, I just want to mention, a lot of people will have this great debate of, ooh, Photoshop, like Photoshop is a dirty word, right? And I love to just use the example of Ansel Adams. He was the forerunner of Photoshop, right? Like, he was everything that we do in Photoshop, with the exception of some things, he was doing in the darkroom. So if you're unfamiliar with it, we used to have photo negatives, and those negatives, you would shoot light through the negative and expose photosensitive paper that you would then treat with chemicals to be able to develop the image. And there are a lot of things that you can do to be able to take. On the left of this screen is the negative, which is just what you've taken with the camera. And on the right is the final visualized print, or essentially what the artist has done to be able to heighten the drama of the image, or essentially to be able to tell the viewer, this is what I saw, this is my experience in this moment, and the camera didn't do a perfect job of capturing that. And the way that Ansel Adams talked about it is just, the negative is similar to a musician's score, and the print to the performance of that score. So this is a huge area of debate, and everyone has a different line that they won't cross. And my line is artificial skies that you can add, or artificial pieces that weren't taken in the photo. I feel like that's my line of, maybe that's too far. But even that, there's a time and a place where it might be an effective use of a tool that's available. So general workflow before we dive into the program that I'll use to edit the photo. Import the raw file into your program. That might be on your phone, that might be on your computer. And then here's the way that I move through processing an image. First, I'll set the white and the black point. We'll talk about what that is and what that does. And then I'll adjust the highlights and the shadows. Finally, I'll do the white balance and the temperature. Occasionally, I'll do that sooner in my workflow depending on the image. And then I go through a bunch of comparisons. I compare it to the original photo to see how it's comparing. I compare it to reference images that I took with my phone. And then from there, it's a bunch of fine tuning. But this is the general workflow. And then this is an image of the sliders that we'll use to be able to do this. So I'm gonna stop showing my screen and then show my screen on a different window. All right. I need to stop it again. Just a second. This is always a little bit finicky. All right, main screen and show. So the program that I'll be working in today is Lightroom. I typically work in Lightroom and Photoshop as my two platforms, which are both offered by Adobe. And the general layout, I'm in the develop panel. I'm not going to go too much into the quirks of Lightroom. Today, I'm just going to focus on how do we edit this image. So right now we're looking at the raw file. Up here, it's going to be a bit small on your screen, but if you can see my cursor, I'm hovering over what's called the histogram of the image, this graph up here. And if I click on the photo, it's going to tell me that I shot this using ISO 100. So that's again going back to one of those tips. And then I was using a 35mm lens. F10 is the aperture, and 1/100th of a second. So if you remember my rule of thumb, double the lens and then 1 over that number is the lowest shutter speed that you should use for a crisp image. And so here I'm following that rule and then giving a little bit of wiggle room as well. The highest this lens can go is an f16. If I was on a tripod, I probably would have adjusted the settings to get there. But I was hand holding standing in the water for this shot. The next thing, so we're starting with the whites and the blacks. So down here, the white point is this slider. This is gonna be a little bit tricky to see on your screen. This is as big of a window as I can get, but as I'm moving this slider, I'm just gonna move it all the way to the bottom, all the way to the top. And what this slider is doing is telling the image how bright the brightest parts of the image can be. The trick with this is that if you look at this little caret up here, again, I apologize for how small this is, that is going to show you if the image is clipping. So I just turned those carets on by clicking them and now they're outlined. So if I go above, those red areas are clipping. And what clipping means is that there's no information there in that part of the image. And so if we were to print this image, that would just be paper underneath. There would be no pigment placed on top. So the goal of what we're trying to do is preserve all the details, but make it as bright as possible, make all that red disappear. And so I prefer to edit without that color. So I just go down until those carets are gray. So that's setting the white point. For this particular image, it's set at 28. Now here on the black point, doing the same thing, going as far as I can until that caret is grayed out. And so that's -8. And then from here, it's a judgment call. You know, if I'm feeling like I want richer blacks, you know, I would actually bring this slider down, darken the image. And if I wanted the image to have more of like a faded film look, I'd bring that black point up. So there is a level of creativity, but where I like to start is right on the edge before it starts clipping anywhere in the image. So white point, black point. The next thing that I like to adjust is highlights. Every once in a while, this blue part up here is going to be way off the image like that. And the solution is to bring the highlights down. But let me just back up. another great thing is Command Z on a Mac to be able to undo what you've done. So the white point, black point, and then I like to bring the highlights down just a little bit. And I want to see into the image. So I want to bring the shadows up. And let me just check here. If you click Y in Lightroom, it's going to give you a before and after. And this is actually flipped. I don't think that's correct. So the after is on the left. All right, the computer is with GoToWebinar and the program open, it's having a little bit of a hard time. So I'm going to give it a minute to catch up. So next thing I like to do on this image, we've worked our way through quite a bit of it, but I want to work on the color. Now the color in this image feels pretty good to me. It's pretty neutral, but it feels like it's missing some of the vibrancy that I saw there, especially in the mountain and in this foreground. And so I'm going to go to these sliders up here. And right now it's as shot, just as the camera interpreted it. I had set the temperature settings to just a daylight, essentially. So I'm just going to warm this up a little bit. And one of the things that I like, this is just another trick of something that can help a little bit, is go to your saturation, bump that saturation all the way, and then come up to the slider and push it over. So you're seeing we're editing the image from orange to blue. And as you come across, because I bumped the saturation up, I'm trying to find that place where those two meet, where it's not blue and it's not orange. It's about there. Same thing on green. Green versus purple, and then find that middle point. Some people find that helpful. Some images I find that helpful. But I'm just going to go back to where we started and show you what I typically do. So this is the original image. To me, it needs a little bit of warmth, but not too much that it would be orange, just a little bit. And then it feels like it could use a little magenta. Another thing that we can consider, programs now are introducing some pretty wild AI settings. And so you used to have to do this manually, but now I can just select the sky with a filter. It's going to take a second with everything my computer is doing right now. And I'm just going to go with highlights and bring them down a bit. And what that's doing is it's matching the exposure of the water. Be really gentle on exposure. Anytime you touch the exposure setting, it's a little bit of a dangerous place to be working. So just bringing that down a smidge, going back into these settings. Now at this point, again, all of these things, you want to do them with care and maybe try not to put anything on too strong. But I like to bump the contrast just a hair. And so at this point, I'm fairly happy with this image. I would spend quite a bit more time to get it polished, but with a landscape like this, sometimes a dehaze can just crisp things up a little bit more. That's not going to be available on all programs, but Lightroom carries that. And that's a place where I'm pretty happy with that particular image. That feels pretty good to me. So let's take a look at one more example. Here's the promised color checker in the field. So I took an image of that color checker, and then I took an image of the landscape. And this is a way to circumvent that step, where all I would have to do is grab this dropper from these sliders, come over here and pick a mid-gray, which would be one of these two. And if you noticed over here, the original image is 6150 for the cool versus warm, and then plus 11 for the magenta versus green. And when I took the dropper and put it on that mid-gray, it bumped it up to 64 and plus 9. So it's just a slight change, but that tells you that's accurate. And then I'm selecting these two images on the bottom, and I'm going to sync just the white balance. And then that takes this image, and the color is automatically ready to go. Oh, there it is. So I haven't edited this photo yet, but at least I've set the temperature so that it's good. The last thing I'll show you is just, I hit the auto button just now, and that's a great reference point to be able to see what does that do and what does that look like. One more point just to mention in this whole journey of editing photos. Some people will say, you're cheating, you're bringing in colors that weren't there. But when you shoot raw, the camera is in the way that the software is coding is that it's shooting incredibly flat, and that image actually won't look like what you saw in the real world. When you shoot JPEG, your camera is actually interpolating those pixels, and it's already doing essentially an automatic version of what we're doing here. And so this is just ways to try and recreate what you saw and be able to share that with someone to be able to transport them to your experience in that place. Now, this was in the bog just the other day, and even though we did that color checker, it's not going to be perfect. And so I'm still going to futz with the colors to be able to try and get it to the place where I felt like I was seeing the color, that particular color on that particular day. So I think in the interest in time, we have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to speed edit this photo, just applying everything that we've learned so far. And this is an aerial image. And these images of peatlands have been a huge challenge for me, and especially photographing them in the fall. I've been working on the Northern Peatlands Project, which is a project I've started to be able to catalog these incredible places that are at risk due to climate change, but they can also be huge climate solutions. And so these images are a challenge because these landscapes are really hard to understand. I'm about 400 feet off the ground on this image, facing straight down. And in the middle of the image is the transition between forest and peatland. And so this is really flat, really neutral, both because I underexposed it, because I wanted to be able to get the right shutter speed, and because I shot it in RAW. So starting with the blacks until they clip, move them down, whites until they clip, move them up. And then this image is actually feeling really good. I will open up the shadows, which just takes the darkest parts of your image and heightens the exposure of those. I'm going to drop the highlights down just a smidgen, but the color work on this image is going to take a lot. So I'm just going to show you the next level of what I would do. So first, I would do these sliders, and to me, that's blue, that's orange, that's somewhere in between, that's green, that's red, that's somewhere in between. And then if you want to get really fancy, you'd start to use these sliders down here, which are manipulating individual colors so that you can get a balanced image and one that reflects what you saw in the field. And the next thing that I would do is really I would avoid these and I would edit in Photoshop. And I think that that's going to have to be saved for another time. But just to show you the flexibility that you have, if I just move this slider, it's only impacting reds in the image. And that's the hue. So it's actually changing the wavelength of those reds as they're interpreted. So that's for another time, but hopefully this gives you a sense of what's possible, and hopefully it gets you excited to be able to explore the possibilities of this. So I'm just going to stop sharing this screen and pop over to the presentation again. All right, should be showing the presentation. Just to give you a heads up that on these dates, I'll be right back here with the Daily Dose of Nature, hosted by Natural Habitat Adventures. So if you're excited about today's webinar, not all of my webinars go into photography. So if you're interested in hearing about some of the trips that you can take with NatHab, or to dive into the ecosystem that I've been spending a lot of time on, which is Northern Peatlands, come back for one of these dates. I'll be posting the topics soon in terms of which one of these dates will be covering which topic. And also, if you're interested in learning more about that Northern Peatlands project, My work will be on display at the Richard F. Brush Gallery up in Canton, New York. The opening ceremony is next week on Monday. It's on October 16th at 6:30 p.m. I'll be doing a chat with other artists who are exhibited in that collective exhibit. And you can also find some of my work by heading to my website, twoline.com/tracks is going to bring you to stories from the field, and you'll get to learn about some of those incredible ecosystems that I've been spending time in. Here's just a sample of a couple stories you'll find if you head there, and you can sign up with your email if you head to that website, and you'll get a monthly dose of peat delivered to your inbox if you're interested. So I'd love it if you'd get in touch if you have any questions. We've got a few more minutes here to be able to answer a few questions before this webinar wraps up, but thank you all so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much. Now that before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So how much more space does shooting in RAW take up versus the alternative?
Yeah, so that'll really depend on your camera that you're using. You know, phones now actually have the ability to shoot RAW depending on the phone, but it's probably going to quadruple your storage needed. But one thing I would recommend if you're nervous about storage is that there's a setting on your camera where you can shoot JPEG plus RAW. And what that allows you to do is when you import your photos, just import the JPEGs, save space, just have those. If you find one in that stack that you really love and you want to edit and you want to really bring to the next level, then you can go back to your camera memory card, download that raw image, and that way you're saving space on your computer. And if you didn't love anything, just go ahead and delete all the raw photos and don't even mess with that. There are a lot of cloud-based services to address storage issues, but even for me as a professional photographer, I struggle with that. It's expensive. You have to have extra hard drives. A lot of cloud storage is expensive, and so definitely a consideration. But that JPEG plus RAW setting in your camera will at least give you the option so that later you can choose that raw image.
Great, thank you. Now, for someone who just started shooting in RAW, what program would you recommend to start with processing?
Definitely. There are some free programs out there that have great ability. I'm incredibly biased. I'll come out of the gate saying that. Lightroom Classic is my favorite application. It's easy to use, and Adobe has built-in tips and tricks in terms of learning how to use the program so that it's not so intimidating. And I would avoid Photoshop for a couple of years until you feel like you're really happy with Lightroom, and you're starting to want to push to that next level. But Photoshop is probably, to me in my workflow, I would say Lightroom is 1/10 the amount of energy and time that it takes to edit a photo. I only go to Photoshop if I'm going to print and it's going to be a big print or it's a higher stakes project. Most of what I do is in Lightroom.
So why do you need to layer images if you shoot in RAW where all that info is available to you?
The only time I'm layering images personally is if I'm doing night sky photography. And with night sky photography, often the general rule of thumb to try and get pinprick stars is to shoot no slower than 10-second exposures. And at that length of exposure, the camera starts to get a lot of noise in the image, and noise can be negated by doing the same exact exposure 10 to 20 times and then it's stacking it in Photoshop. Don't worry about that. You can take incredible pictures without it. Again, that's only if you're going to be printing really big prints, big meaning like maybe 20 by 30 or bigger. and you're just, a pixel hunter. This is something that even me, who has been editing photos for 10 years, I only got into stacking in the last 6 months because I was starting to really want some crisp images that would print really large. Prior to that, there was no need because it was a really extensive amount of time. But there's a lot of videos out there. It's fun to do once and then decide if it's something that you want to do again. But really, it comes down to, if you have a really long shutter speed, you start to get noise in the image. Or if you're shooting by hand and you need to bump the ISO really far up, which I would say like above 1600, depending on the camera, is what would be called a high ISO, that you would start to be getting noise that you'd want to counteract with multiple exposures, which would be at least 10 images that you would stack in a blend in Photoshop.
Great, thank you. So how do the sun and the subject need to be lined up in order for a dramatic reflection to be visible to the camera? Is that just luck?
I'm guessing like a sun flare is what you're talking about, to be able to get some of those artifacts that as the sun is coming through the lens. Basically, you need to point at the sun. Don't look through your viewfinder unless you have a mirrorless camera, because the mirrorless camera is just a digital reproduction of it. But then the focus needs to be far enough away from the camera that it's effectively infinity. And then you need to have an f-stop that's a really big number, which means a small opening, to be able to create that star effect. But my recommendation is just go into manual mode or into aperture or shutter priority and just play around with putting the sun behind your subject. So it's sun, subject, camera pointing at the sun and the subject, and focus on the subject and try different distances from the object. And every time I go out, all of those variables are changing. So it just comes down to playing around with the variables. How far away am I? What f-stop do I have? Which one gives me the best look that I'm trying to get? Yeah, great question.
What ratio do you use when taking a picture with reflections in the water?
Do you mean, I guess you might mean like a crop, or the size of the image in terms of that, or maybe you mean the horizon line, or even where the line is. There are kind of a lot of variables there. To me, it really comes down to playing around with a lot of compositions to see which one you like the most. Trial and error is the best way to do photography, in my opinion. And then it comes down to, obviously there are all those amazing rule of thirds, trying to divide the image up into 3 bands, vertically or horizontally or both, and then trying to build that composition within that. Hopefully that answers your question. And if I didn't, throw another question in the chat to clarify.
So do you use focus stacking for landscape photos or just exposure bracketing?
For landscape photos, and exposure bracketing is something that I don't do often. Exposure bracketing is when we mentioned it earlier, and it's just when you're creating 5 photos, 10 photos, 15 photos at different exposures of the same image. So whoever asked the question clearly knows, but just in case folks didn't know. And it's helpful when you have really bright highlights, for instance, a bright sky, and then also really dark areas. And if your goal is to evenly expose everything so that the sky isn't so bright and that the foreground isn't so dark, that it's all more of a mid-tone, or that you have the flexibility to be able to edit where the lights and darks are, then you go into bracketing, and then you start stacking the image, and you can create masks and be able to create areas that are brighter or darker based on what you're trying to accomplish in the image. It'd be easier to take an example if we had more time, but yeah, that's a great question.
So you probably shoot hundreds or maybe even thousands of images in an outing. How do you decide which ones that you do want to edit in detail?
Yeah, to streamline things, I actually I started in film and I try to put myself in that mindset when I'm shooting, with a little bit of a caveat because you're obviously not. But I find that it's helpful to me to not just shoot crazy amounts of photos. I get overwhelmed pretty quickly. I try to be intentional about what I'm taking so that it's not thousands when I come home from a shoot. And then the next step that I do, I import everything into Lightroom. And it's nice because different programs do this, but you can either flag or star images. And I'll just go through and it's just gut instinct, just a quick yes or no. And if it's a yes, I give it a star. If it's a no, I don't. And then once I've gone through all the photos, I have not edited yet. I'm just going through on gut instinct if something's nice. Then I can just select all the starred photos, and that whittles it down to usually about a third of what I've done. And then I look at those, and then I go through and see which ones I want to give 2 stars to, and then I filter down to those, and then I edit those. And every once in a while, I'll go through my big library of all the photos I've ever taken, and I'll find some photos where I actually passed on them when they would be great photos. So it's nice to keep them, but it's also expensive and you know, uses a lot of storage. But good question.
Great. Well, thank you, Charlie. Unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for some closing comments.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining today, and feel free to get in touch with me if you have more questions. Check out my work, follow me on Instagram, and would love to hear from you, and feel free to tune in again next time. And thanks for joining, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including our registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.